Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It's my great honor to introduce our next speaker, Patricia June Vickers, who will be speaking to us about Adaawx, sacred stories, and healing. Dr. Vickers belongs to the Eagle clan from the village of Gitxaala, British Columbia, where she carries a feast hall name as well as one from the Nuxalk village in Bella Coola, British Columbia. She completed her interdisciplinary doctorate studying the transformative aspects of the Tsm'syen ancestral law. With the help of neurofeedback and ancestral principles, she teaches spiritual transformation, healing trauma, awakening, forgiveness, and unearthing layers to find the authentic self. Please join me in warmly welcoming Patricia.
Hello, everyone. I want to say that I'm a guest on Coast Salish territory. I live in North Vancouver, British Columbia. And I understand that Stanford University is in the Muwekma Ohlone territory. And I send a prayer out for the Muwekma people, for those living today, for those yet to be born, and in gratitude for all prayers prayed by their ancestors. May all know peace. So what I want to say first before I begin to read this slide is that all that I'm covering comes from my own personal journey of healing. And of course, it influences how I've pulled this together and all of the information. So I want to say that out front. This talk is a window, a small portal into the spiritual teachings of respect in everyday life from my perspective. I have not been given authority by my home community of Gitxaala to speak on their behalf. Tsm'syen peoples have sacred stories. They're Adaawx that teach foundational principles of living a good life, a life that is spiritually balanced. Ancestral teachings help us to go beyond making sense of cultural atrocities to seeing the supernatural in the present moment. May this message be a seed of goodness for all. So, my lineage on my mother's side is both her parents were from England. She was born in Canada. She went to my father's village as a teacher, a federal day school teacher, and a field matron. She had trained as a missionary to go to China. That's where she wanted to go. But in the 40s, China wasn't open to Christian missionaries. And so she wound up in my father's village. So you can see that there are 7 major language groups in the province of BC. So the pink, the Haida, is where my father's grandfather is from, my great-grandfather. And then the Tsm'syen, just across from Haida Gwaii, is the village of Gitxaala. It's on a small island. And then south, also on an island, is where my father's father is from. He was Hailtuk from the community of Bella. And I identify as Tsm'syen because my mother was adopted as an adult woman when she had my 2 eldest brothers. And so that's why I say I'm Tsm'syen. Here this is us. And there are three dialects of Tsm'syen. Tsm'syen is our language. So on the coast is where I'm from. And then along the Nass River, which goes up this way to the northern part, they're the Niska. And then up the Skeena River, so there are two major rivers in Tsm'syen territory, the Nass and the Skeena. And up the Skeena River are the Gitxaala. So that's to give you an idea of where I'm from. So we're matrilineal. We follow the woman, the mother, and that's the main reason why my mother was adopted. So we would have a place in our society. So there are 4 tribes in Gitxaala. There's the killer whale, the wolf, the raven, and the eagle. And my mother was adopted into the eagles. The tribes are comprised of houses, and each house has a head chief and a head matriarch, with noble ones in training to eventually carry the names of the leaders. So here we have Adaawx is our ancestral law, and all of this is under our ancestral law. It's also the living aspect of our law. So you have in the middle here, the house, and here is our social structure where we have chiefs, matriarchs, those in waiting, headmen, and as well a speaker for the chief. So here we have some Tsm'syen word, wa, for house, and Padeich, that's the 4 tribes that I mentioned. And what I'm going to be speaking to is Adaawx. So our Adaawx, or our sacred stories, are accounts of human relations with supernatural beings and the land acquiring. That's how our chiefs got their crests and their power. So our stories come from these encounters with supernatural beings, also known as Nuxalk in Tsm'syen. So here we see how there's this connection between the people, the land. So we have our medicine plants like everywhere else, animals, the water. So we're ocean people, territories and tribal boundaries. So each chief has a specific geographical area that's his or hers. And then here we have the spirit world, the Nuxalk, or the supernatural beings. And one of the supernatural beings is Mouse Woman. And Tsm'syen was half human, half supernatural. And there are many stories of Tsm'syen throughout some Adaawx speaking territories. And Tsm'syen is it would be like a common Adaawx, so anybody can tell a story of Tsm'syen. And this is Delgamuch's address. Delgamuch was a Gitxaala chief. So this again is looking at how we're organized. And this is his address to the crown. And this was the Delgamuch and Gitxaala court case in BC. For us, the ownership of territory is a marriage of the chief and the land. Each chief has an ancestor who encountered and acknowledged the life of the land. From such encounters come power. The land, the plants, the animals, and the people all have spirit. They must be shown respect. That is the basis of our law. Adaawx are sacred stories of Tsm'syen peoples. Adaawx tell of encounters with Nuxalk, supernatural beings that inhabit specific areas in the territories of the chiefs. The encounters bring power for the individual and their wap or house. So now I'm moving from where I'm from and a little bit about who we are as Tsm'syens. And I'm going to begin to look at our colonial history. And the reason I'm doing this is because my doctoral was about looking for the transformative aspects of our Adaawx, or our ancestral law. And in order to do that, I also had to look at our history, because that's my responsibility as a Tsm'syen woman, to look at the whole, to be able to see the whole, not just the immediate. So a careful reading of history shows that Canada was founded on a series of bargains with Aboriginal peoples. Bargains this country has never fully honored. Treaties between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal governments were agreements to share the land. They were replaced by policies intended to remove Aboriginal people from their homelands, suppress Aboriginal nations and their governments, undermine Aboriginal cultures, and stifle Aboriginal identity. And you will notice with these slides that sometimes it's Aboriginal, sometimes it's Indigenous, sometimes First Nations. They're all interchangeable. And this comes from the highlights of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So this isn't the school that my grandmother and my father went to. They went to St. Michael's Anglican Indian Residential School in Alert Bay. So it was over a day's travel, about 2 days travel, for my grandmother, who was about 6 years old. She was born in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So for her at 6, to travel from Gitxaala down to Alert Bay, which is a different language, it's Kwakiutl territory, was really an enormous change for her. And then my father also went to St. Michael's. My grandmother grew up there. And as far as I know, my father attended 1 year at St. Michael's and he refused to go back. I understand he did grade 4. And then he attended federal day school. This also comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a document that you can find online. For over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments. So all that I went over, the Adaawx, all of that, who we are and how we're organized, that's our government. Ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct, legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. Between 2007 and 2015, the Government of Canada provided about $72 million to support the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, TRC. The TRC spent 6 years, traveling to all parts of Canada and heard from more than 6,500 witnesses. What a research project. The person who was the lead of that was Minister Murray Sinclair. He was, and still is, Anishinaabe, a lawyer and a judge. And he ensured that the process was going to be in line with our common ancestral principles of respect. So 6,500 witnesses is incredible to be listening to the horrible, horrible things that children, when they were children, what they witnessed, and then what was done to them. In 2021, 215 child remains were found in Kamloops on the Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds. That's in the interior of BC. Currently, 10,028 unmarked graves have been found in only 11 school grounds that have been searched. There are still 128 school grounds that need to be searched. I was called into one of the interior communities to be of support. I am a psychotherapist to community, and they were ready. They are in the interior. They're pipe people. They carry pipes and do ceremony using pipes. They were also ready, and they have those who were you get brushed off. So they use eagle feathers to brush off. They also use juniper branches because that's the medicine tree in the interior, or shrub actually. So they were ready. They were ready in traditional way to face the horrors of the numbers. And then again, St. Joseph's, which was also a Catholic residential school in Williams Lake. They called me in again to be of support before they knew the number of remains that were recovered at St. Joseph's Mission, and they were 92. When I was working on my dissertation and looking at this history, it was as though I was being dragged behind a vehicle with a rope around me. And I felt all my skin felt raw. I didn't know what to do in 2006 with all that I was reading, and wondered why it was that I didn't have all this information. Why wasn't it all organized to access? So one of the things I did, this is titled Taking Them Home. And the women on the coast have the hand-woven baskets, and they go to gather driftwood on the beach to take home for the fires, for cooking and for keeping the house warm. And this is children from a residential school in the Northwest Territories. And on her feet are these figures down here. They are a soul catcher. So they're from a Tsm'syen soul catcher, bone soul catcher. And you can see the village in the distance where she's taking them back home. Last year, so this was published in 2014, Ian Mosby, a food historian and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Guelph, revealed details of highly unethical nutrition experiments performed on Canadian Aboriginal children at 6 residential schools between 1942 and 1952, our own medical atrocities. The experiments were performed by the Department of Indian Affairs of Canada under the direction of 2 physicians, Dr. Percy Moore, the Indian Affairs Branch Superintendent of Medical Services, and Dr. Frederick Tisdall, a famed nutritionist, a former president of the Canadian Pediatric Society and one of 3 pediatricians at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Ontario, who developed pablum infant cereal in the 1930s. In these experiments, parents were not informed nor were consents obtained. Even as children died, the experiments continued. Forced sterilization refers to the practice of sterilizing Indigenous women without free and informed consent. Based on eugenics beliefs and policies, sexual sterilization acts were passed in Alberta 1928 to 1972 and British Columbia 1933 to 1973 and were not repealed until the 1970s. Under the Acts, a board of eugenics could order sterilization of institutionalized patients who, if discharged without being subjected to an operation for sexual sterilization, would be likely to beget or bear children who, by reason of inheritance, would have a tendency to serious mental disease or mental deficiency. I didn't know about sterilization in the States and in Canada until I went down to, my sister was working at one of the treatment centers down in Arizona in Tucson, and I went to do a practicum there, and we traveled up to White Mountain Apache, and we wanted to go and visit the Elders Center because we heard it was really, really wonderful. They had outdoor ovens, and they were cooking and eating traditional food. So we just mingled amongst them, and one elder in particular connected with me, and she invited me to see her little suite. And while we were there, she told me that she only had one child because she got sick and she had to travel south. And she went through surgery. Her appendix were removed. And she said, when I got back, I couldn't have any more children. And I could feel it when she said this, and was a little bit stunned because I realized I actually met someone who was sterilized as a young woman. This is another bone soul catcher, because to me, when we're looking at history, whether it's in Canada or the United States, our history, I think this whole supernatural world is in somatic experiencing, they say, a resource, and it's our biggest resource. I was motivated to inquire into the history of wrongdoing to my father and my grandparents, not only in Indian residential schools, but also through social conditioning. I wanted to understand how my father could sexually abuse my young daughters, my girlfriends, and me when I was a child. My life had been shattered, and I needed to understand how my father lost respect for himself and others. He was not only troubled and unstable, but he was also disoriented. And so was I, from the incest throughout my childhood. So Frank Corrigan has done this really tremendous work, deep brain reorienting. And so as a psychotherapist, what I first went into counseling in the 90s, the mid-90s, to become a psychotherapist. And then as I began to look at my history, and this is just a general statement of my childhood, that it wasn't only the doctoral dissertation that helped me to see the bigger picture, but also I was living with dissociative amnesia. And I knew this because I'm blessed to be in a family where we're all working towards truthfulness and being in good relationship with each other. I have 4 brothers and 1 sister. Our parents are no longer alive, but when my eldest brother was in treatment at the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona, we were all there except for 1 sibling. Our parents were there. And that's when our silence ended and we began to talk without blaming about what was happening in the house. So that deep brain reorienting and facing disorientation is really an important part in life. Whether or not you have a history of loss in your childhood, suffering in your childhood, it's a good thing to know, because we all get disoriented somehow, some way. So the other thing that I began to look at, and I'll say that when I was in my 30s, I was really angry as I began to see all of these things. Cognitive bias and conditioning. I was conditioned to believe my father was a pedophile and alcoholic because he was an Indian. I was conditioned to believe I was inferior in every and all ways as a human being. I came to see I was socially conditioned to believe I was defective and a failure. And incest sealed or confirmed that conditioned belief. I said, well, it must be true. Social statistics and suffering in our personal, in our family, tribal, and community lives verified colonial conditioning of subhuman existence. That's without neuroscience, without understanding the impact of trauma on the individual, but also the collective brain. So I'm deeply grateful for the work, the trauma work in neuroscience. So what's helped? What's helped to be able to see the bigger picture as I've looked at all of these different facets of our history as Indigenous people on this continent? So this comes from, he was a hereditary chief. He was also a teacher. He was also a survivor of Indian residential schools. Niska elder and teacher Bert McKay writes of Ayuk Niska principles. Ayuk is a Niska pronunciation of a Yao, which is the coasts, Tsm'syen, and then Gitxaans say Ayok, all ancestral law. The first is respect. Respect, according to our philosophy, is spelled out this way. When you understand the meaning of respect, you have a power that emanates from you, and the people around you will respond likewise. They will treat you respectfully. And so, when it comes to the laws of the Niska, if you can't understand the meaning of respect, then it means you are going to be running afoul of every area of the Niska law. So we're coming back to looking now at Adaawx. And Adaawx are the sacred stories. Adaawx have 4 general phases. And this is my looking at Adaawx. The first is an offense. So offense of some kind happens. An offense would be disrespect. 2, then the journey. So what happens to the individual after the disrespect? Because correction is coming. And then 3, the feet. So I'll tell you in Adaawx, and we can move through these 4. So, and we all have, I think all of us, our personal story is a sacred story. It's an Adaawx. So we encounter or we offend, then we have to work with what we've done, that responsibility. And then the feet. How is it that we come to change, to admit that what we've done is wrong? That's the feet. And then the final one is the teaching. What has the supernatural taught me? How is it that I then come back to help others? So really, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here today. Because you've been hearing in the first part what the offense is against my grandmother, against my father, and then how that was passed on to me through my father, and then my journey. So I have 4 adult children, I have 10 grandchildren, and as a young mother, I had a lot of rage. So my journey was a difficult one until I got the help I needed. And so those are the 4 parts. And they're not they don't come necessarily in this order. So, but we know that they have these 4 parts. So here's an Adaawx. This is in Prince Rupert School District has really done a lot of work. And I want to say that one of the things that I did is I grew up hearing Tsm'syen. My grandparents would come and live with us during the winter months. And then I would hear them talking with my father. They'd be talking back and forth. Because my mother lived in the village for 13 years, she understood what they were saying, but she didn't speak it. She said, my tongue's too thick. So, but she sang in the language. So I'd hear them speaking, but I didn't actually learn myself until I went to Oklahoma, because that's where John Dunn lived, a linguist who worked with my grandmother. And John recorded a lot of our stories in the language. He wrote the Tsm'syen dictionary. And so I thought, I'm going to go and see John, because John will be able to tell me about shame, about suffering, and how we talk about it in our language. That's what I thought. So I thought, I'll go, because listen to this white man speak the language. He just sounds like a Gitxaala. So I flew to Oklahoma, and he welcomed me into his home. And I asked him, when we talk about shame, how do we talk about it? What do we say in the language? And the first thing John did is he went to the Niska dictionary, and he went to the Tsm'syen dictionary. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm going to look to see if we have shame in the dictionary. And I said, don't you know how to talk about it in a language? And he said, no. So I learned something about linguistics. And but also, when we speak another language and we speak it from the heart, you'd think a person really knows and is at home in the language. And that's what I thought with John, but it wasn't so. And that was okay, because he taught me how to read my language. So I read this story in both Somaliach and English, this story of the otter hunters. So it happens on the coast, and before the men go out hunting, they go through a cleansing time. So Devil's Club is used, bathing, fasting, and they're not to have sexual relationships with their partners at all. During this time, they're in seclusion. Well, the helmsman didn't abide by this, and he had sexual relationships with his wife during this cleansing time. No one, of course, knew this. And so then we just had canoes, and there were a number of canoes going out to hunt otter at the same time. And this particular hunter, whenever he would go to spear an otter, he would miss. And his crew, that was okay for the first day, but this happened again the next day and the next day. And when they went out the next time, he saw this huge white otter. And he was determined to get it. And when he went to spear it, it took the spear in its mouth because it was a spirit otter. And by the rope of the canoe, he pulled the whole canoe down into a huge whirlpool and down into the territory of the otter chief. And why did that happen? Well, that happened because he was disrespectful. The cleansing, we do the cleansing because we're going to take a life as a hunter. And that's a sacred thing. And so we need to be respectful. So because he wasn't respectful, he put his whole crew in danger. And so really the result of that would be death. And not just for the helmsman, but all of the hunters in the canoe with him, his whole team, his whole crew. And while they were down there and they were being held, before they went to meet with the chief, Mouse Woman came and she brought to the helmsman, because he realized what he'd done and was remorseful about what he'd done, the disrespect. And she brought to him the fat of mountain goat, which is like just the prize food for any chief. And she gave it to the helmsman, the hunter, and he presented it to the otter chief. And there were words that passed and went back and forth. And because this act of respect, this act of acknowledging the chief and what it was that he'd done wrong, he and his whole crew were spared their lives. And all of this happened in the chief's big house. You saw that house and all the members of the house. It happened in that house. And so there were witnesses. There were witnesses to this transaction. And then the crew, they were taken back up to the surface again. And that's why I can tell you this Adaawx of the otter hunters, because they came back and they spoke about the supernatural otters and the importance of respect. This comes from a Gitxaala pole. I love it, human with I think that's a raven on top. Yes, raven. The raven has the straight beak. So in our Adaawx, those who gained transformational power went through a rigorous training period, which included fasting, cleansing with Devil's Club, seclusion, and abstaining from intimate relationships. As in any and perhaps all religions, cleansing is an essential part for positive change. So when I look at transformation in my life, I want to say that Raymond Harris, who was a Arapaho, he traveled through the Canadian prairies to First Nations there, bringing back the sweat lodge to the people. So the sweat lodge isn't our traditional cleansing way, but my eldest brother, who's an artist, he had Jack Lacerte, who was from Notley. He was Wet'suwet'en. Jack trained under Raymond Harris, who was Arapaho. And so my brother asked me to join him in the sweat lodge. And this would be under Raymond Harris's teachings through Jack Lacerte. And I found a really good way to pray, to be open to light and to truth, to forgiveness, and to seeing in a good way. And as well as the sweat lodge is the fasting. And so then I learned how to make my own little lodge. And that's going 4 days and 4 nights without any fluids or solids. And what the fasting does in a ceremonial way is those times that I went through the fast on my brother's property, he's in Gitxaala territory, Jack and Roy sang a journeying song that took me from the natural world into the supernatural world. So what we know as Tsm'syens is it's always there, the supernatural world. We always have access to it. And so cleansing and fasting help us to be able to recognize this in everyday life. This comes from Tsm'syen, an older Tsm'syen rattle. It's really a beautiful rattle. And this painting is a part of a series. And it made me think about when we were in our mother's womb and we could hear, but we couldn't see. And then we're born and we go through childhood and we become adults. And I think too that this figure is me, that outside of my immediate reality is the supernatural, is the spirit world. And so that's what that land there on that human's belly, that's Gitxaala Inlet, where it's my home. We start with the mind. Traditional cleansing ways assist us to see with our spiritual vision, to awaken within us the capacity to see our limitations without panic. As in the painting, when we were in our mother's womb, we heard and sensed movement beyond our reality, but we're unable to see the reality, yet a part of us knows it's there. It's the same in our adult life. We have limitations. We know or sense the supernatural is beyond our limitation of seeing. So I want time for us to have conversation because I've brought you up north. So in closing, may the pathway of seeing that our ancestors cleared for us be known today. May we find the ability to see clearly without hatred, resentment, or blame. May our seeing bring about a desire to learn to live with understanding and compassion. May we be interconnected with all.
Thank you for sharing so authentically from the depths of your lived journey to offer us the promise of transformation. I'll begin the question session by asking you to say a little bit more about the artwork. Many of the pieces of art were from your own hand. And if you would describe how you introduced the first slide of a watercolor painting of bringing them home with the basket as an introduction to how you handled feeling overwhelmed. So if you could say some more about the process of the creative expression through your drawings and how that's fit into your own journey of transformation.
One thing I did was I developed a 3-week healing from trauma program for Indigenous participants in BC and also for counselors working in Indigenous communities. And I talked to Bessel Vanderkolk about how to pull together the curriculum. And he said, what's important is to have the opportunity to express without words. And I could really relate to that because when in 2006, when I was researching for my doctoral dissertation, there were so many times I didn't have any words. I just had all of these emotions. And so that's when I began to paint more seriously. It wasn't play anymore. I needed to find ways to move beyond anger or resentment or hatred. And painting really helped to do that.
Yeah. Would you also speak to how one finds the sacred stories of one's own lineage? And many people are cut off from the oral transmission of story or even the knowledge of where the sacred stories of their lineage may be held.
I think too, not only in the told stories, sacred stories, but also in songs that we forget that so many songs really help to bring you into the presence of your ancestors. And music, I was on a retreat with my same brother Roy, and we were doing an Angelisarian training, the Fourfold Way, and there was a young woman from Turkey there. And I asked her if she knew any songs. And she said, well, I know a lullaby. She sang it in her language. It was so beautiful. I could just feel it. It was about the moon.
Mm-hmm. So what you're sharing is that the medium of drawings, rattles, paintings, songs, as well as just a prose story, all are a way that the sacred stories are shared.
Yes, yes. And really, if even though my title is Adaawx, which is sacred stories, it's not as though we can compartmentalize. Well, it's like meditation. It's not just our mind that we're learning to sit with. We're learning to sit with our heart and our breath and all these parts of who we are, our body, our past and our present. We're sitting with all of these things all at once. And I think that sacred stories and music and structure and order, all of that, the Adaawx, the Adaawx, the songs, the dances, the fasting, the cleansing, it's all, it calls us, doesn't matter that you're not Tsm'syen. It invites you to come in and to be a part of it. All of it.
You spoke of your brother singing while you were in the sweat lodge. And if you could say more about the process of knowing that there are members of one's community holding you. Often programs such as the one you mentioned at the Meadows describe that the program itself is creating a safe community that offers an embrace of security and support so that the inner journey can occur while there is a circle of care around the individual. To what extent is the process of entering into the journey in the steps that you shared a process that occurs while being held by one other person, whether it be a spiritual teacher or a relative or a community member? Could you say more about that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, given experience. So when my father died, I still didn't have all my memory yet of my relationship with him. I just had little pieces of it. So when he died, all the preparations were happening. So what happens in our communities is we have the father's side, and he was a killer whale, and we have the father's, that's the father's mother's side, and then the father's father's side, which is a different clan. So that was Raven. He was from Bella. So when there's death, then the father's side steps forward. Even though we're matrilineal, the father's side steps forward and does all the organizing. So there's the memorial service that happens, and then the funeral, and then the feast or the dinner where the name is passed on. And the father's side is playing a prominent role throughout this. And my brother Roy did something that hadn't been done for a very long time, and he made a simple pine box for our father. Um, uh, and that's what he was buried in. And then we met with my father's tribe, the killer whales, and we're all eagles. And we were sitting with them at the table. They wanted to know, basically, they wanted to know what they needed to do and what we'd taken care of as his children. And so Roy let them know he was going to make the coffin. And they were really grateful about that because he was bringing back an old tradition. And then they said that they'd chosen me to write the eulogy, and they were happy that was taken care of. And that was about what we'd managed. And then, and we were all having a hard time. And because the elder said he died a troubled man. So one of the wing chiefs spoke up and said, right now as a family, you're a canoe. And the canoe's tipped over on the beach. And he said, where are your boulders? And we're going to be on the other side of you, and we're going to hold you up. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then while all the preparation was happening for the funeral, making cedar roses and food was coming in to on our father's side, all the killer whales were busy. And I could hardly move. And, but always there was someone who sat beside me. They didn't tell me to stop crying. Often they didn't say anything. But if I went into the kitchen and felt like I wanted to get away, I'd go in the kitchen and sit on the floor. And one of my relatives on my dad's side would come and just sit beside me. Sometimes they'd hold my hand, not saying anything, just being there. So I learned a lot, from that, because I'd seen others going through it, but I hadn't been through it myself. So I think these ways around death are really, really important. And that's where today we see the beauty of our ancestral teachings coming to life. I think in general, support in our communities is still really, really a tough thing because trauma changes the brain. Mm-hmm. There are people living with depression, high anxiety, struggling with drugs. And these relatives of mine, they were struggling with drugs and alcoholism, and yet here they were right beside me, just loving me. So as a psychotherapist, what I see in our communities right now is a focus on addictions and not on helping to heal the brain. Mm-hmm. So for me, I realized I couldn't go any longer without living with dissociative amnesia, and that I really had to find a way to remember, and I didn't know how I was going to do that. Mm-hmm. So what a blessing that I'd worked with Steve Milstein and Ulrich Lanius in the 90s in Kwagyu territory. And I contacted Steve and I said, this is what I'm living with. Do you know what else I can do besides EMDR? And he said, yeah, neurofeedback. So, but neurofeedback, the one that I did was lens, which mirrors the functioning of the brain. So the brain denied access to memory. I couldn't access it with my mind, no matter what I did. So I went to see my colleagues, and I gained a lot of memory. And then I made sense to myself. The rage made sense, and so I think, well, what a blessing that I worked with these two wonderful men, and that I've just found out what I need to do, and I just I've been to Spirit Rock to do meditation. I went through treatment at the Meadows. I did all of these things because I wanted to be a loving person. So when we look at atrocities of rape, just ongoing rape throughout childhood in Indian residential schools, we look at attachment disorder. You know, we see we're in the state that we're in socially because of intergenerational trauma. And so what we need is we need healing ways, and not just us, we look at war-torn countries. We need healing ways that support the brain to regulate itself. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, so we combine that with our fasting ways, with our cleansing ways, with our medicine ways. And we bring the two together because they meet beautifully. Why? Because we want to have a good heart. And if we want that, then we're going to find everything that's going to help us to be able to live with a good heart. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to pause and just let us all take that in for a moment. Someone is asking you to kindly name again the two people who were particularly supportive in your healing your brain's ability to access memory, to regulate.
Stephen Milstein, a Jewish psychologist, and Ulrich Lanius, a German psychologist.
Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah. And Ulrich Lanius is Ruth Lanius's brother.
Interesting.
And for those of you who don't know, Ruth Lanius is Canada's leading neuroscientist in healing trauma.
Thank you. We have people interested in the inclusion of the rattle as you're speaking and sharing. Could you help us to respect the role of the rattle and what its timing in your sharing?
Great question. It's used in many different ways, depending on which nation you're from and what the ceremony is. But I've often used it for cleansing. So if I don't have cedar or devil's club or sage or sweetgrass, if I don't have any of those, or if I'm in an apartment and if I can't light them, then I can use a rattle to brush off energy I don't know that needs to come off of me.
Thank you. If I may highlight the 4 steps that you shared, would you offer that to members of all the world's communities that have suffered dismemberment and trauma? Do you feel those steps are particularly relevant for the trauma path that you've been illuminating?
I think that our Adaawx help us to understand that what we long for as human beings is that connection with Eternal Mother, that connection with Eternal Father. We all long for that, to be loved, for freedom, for a sense of belonging, and also for that fun, for that enjoyment, for laughter, and how important that is too. So, you know, I think that that's what most of us are looking for, is that.
To help people fully benefit from your wisdom and insights, Would you also elaborate on the term you used of attachment and attachment disorder? Some people are familiar with what that is referring to.
Right. I think to say that what the grandparents taught and my grandmother taught me when I was carrying my first one was how everything that and not only my grandmother, but elders in the village, everything that I thought and said and did was going to impact the unborn child. And then when the child is born, it's welcomed into the world by not only the mother and father, but by the grandparents and the family, by community. And when we've had that wonderful experience, then we have a sense of being okay, being valued, and being loved. For whatever reason, when we don't have that fullness of welcome, then we seek it if we're looking at Panksepp's work. And one of his emotions is in his his work is amazing. So then that seeking, we're seeking it. So that's how I talk about attachment.
And as you share that, it brings to mind something that I invite your response to, which is coming back to the 4 steps of the offense, the journey, the feat, and the teaching, that as you spoke to attachment, it feels as if those steps are a gestational rebirth, and the earlier illumination of the role of community and midwifery while you're in the sweat lodge by those around you through song is a parallel to what you just illuminated in the transmission of experience to the unborn child during pregnancy. Is that would be the truth that you would put forward?
Sounds good. That sounds good. And I think also when I went to the first potlatch or feast, I would say that was the sense that I had. And that was a Gitxaala feast in Tsm'syen or Adaawx. It was an amazing experience to come to understand that I belong to this way of living and being.
Patricia, thank you wholeheartedly for your generous sharing of your life experience and your deep devotion to giving expression to your kind heart. We look forward to being with you in your interactive workshop and also in your guided practice session. Thank you for starting our time together with this wonderful talk tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all of you for your wonderful hearts. They're great for being here. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.